Hey guys, it's Cassera, and today I'm going to be doing my December reading wrap-up. December, I dedicated the month to doing rereads because it's just a really busy month for me. So most of the books that I read in December were rereads. There were 2 books that I read for the first time, but I reread 13 books that I had previously read. So as always, we're going to start out with my reading stats for the month. So like I mentioned, I read 15 books in the month of December, and we're going to break them down first by category. I read 1 contemporary book, 12 fantasy books, and 2 classics. Then we're going to look at star rating. So my average star rating for the month was 4.5 stars, which is expected because it's a reread month, so it's gonna be a lot of books that I know I already like. I had 6 5-star books, 6 4.5-star books, 2 4-star books, and 1 2.5-star book. Then we're gonna switch to age range, and I'm actually really surprised by the next few categories, just how widely dispersed they were, because usually I have a pattern to these, and this month I didn't really have a pattern at all. Because if we look by age range, I read 5 adult books, 3 new adult books, 6 young adult books, and 1 middle grade. So I read pretty much all age ranges, and somehow I read more YA than adult, which is weird because usually I definitely read more adult than YA, but it happens. So yeah, I'm really surprised by how the age range turned out. And the other one that I'm really surprised by is the page count. I'll put a little chart on the screen over here with the page count diagram, and you'll see, like, normally the one with the most books that I've read is 300 to 400 pages, which is like typical, but for some reason it's just all over the place in the month of December. And I think the highest one is like the 600 to 700 page count. So like, apparently I read a lot of 300 to 400 page books, but the longer books are the ones that I want to reread, apparently. My average page count for the month was 595 pages, which is a lot. I didn't expect for it to be that high. And then we're going to go to my audio to physical book ratio, which typically I try to go for a 50-50 ratio. I didn't even try in the month of December because I was so busy. So I ended up reading 2 physical books and 13 audiobooks. Now is the part of the video where I normally talk about like rereads and DNFs and all of that stuff, but because I did mostly rereads for the month of December, instead I'm going to talk about the books that I read for the first time in December and do my regular wrap up for my rereads in December. So I'm going to start with the lowest rated book and work my way up to the highest rated book for the books that I read for the first time in December. First book on this list is The Fork, the Witch, and the Worm by Christopher Paolini. So this is a series of short stories that is set in the world of the Inheritance Cycle, which I was rereading the Inheritance Cycle in the month of December, which is why I decided to pick up this one right afterwards, because I just wanted more from that world. And I really enjoyed this little series of short stories. I was a little disappointed by it just because there were a lot of characters that are really prevalent in the Inheritance Cycle that I loved and I wanted to see more from, that just weren't in these short stories at all. And then there was like the 3rd short story I really didn't enjoy that much. Like the first 2 were really interesting and they're about characters that I wanted to know more from, and then the 3rd short story was about Urkels, which I didn't really care for very much, so I ended up giving that one 3.75 stars. And the other book that I read for the first time in the month of December is The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. So this is a really long book. I actually started it at like the beginning of November and finally finished it in the first week of December. I really enjoyed this book. It is definitely the ultimate revenge story, like everyone says it is, and I love the way that it's written. I think I enjoyed the beginning of the series a lot more than the end. There's definitely a section in the middle where it starts to get kind of like meandering and boring, but like everything does come together in the end, and I love that. But at the same time, this book seems a little bit longer than it needs to be. Like there are definitely sections that can get cut out of this book, but I still really enjoyed it, and I ended up giving that one 4.5 stars. Now we're going to move on to all of the rereads that I did in the month of December. Just to make this easier, I'm just going to talk about each series by itself rather than trying to go by the lowest to highest rated book in each series. So I'm going to start with like my lowest rated series and then work my way up to the highest rated. So the first one I want to talk about is the A Court of Thorns and Roses series by Sarah J. Maas, which includes A Court of Thorns and Roses, A Court of Mist and Fury, and A Court of Wings and Ruin. So this series I decided to reread because I remember reading it last year and being surprised by how much I actually liked it. Because the first book in the series last year I didn't actually like. I had kind of read it to make fun of it a little bit, and then I picked up the second book and I loved the second book and the 3rd book in the series. I particularly loved the characters. So this series follows a character named Farah who is kind of taken from her family to go live in Fairy because she kills a fairy at the very beginning of the series. So her life is forfeit, basically. The first book in the series is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, and the second book is a Hades and Persephone retelling. I didn't know that going into it the first time, but I did kind of want to see what it was like going into the second time, knowing these aspects of it. And I felt very similarly in the first two books as I did the first time around. The first time around, I gave A Court of Thorns and Roses 2 stars. This time around, I gave it 2.5 stars because the first half of this book is still really boring. The first time around, I felt like there wasn't really a romance in it, and even knowing the second time around that it's supposed to be a Beauty and the Beast retelling and these characters are supposed to be getting attached to each other, there were moments where like it would feel like a little bit forced. Like I think there was this one specific moment I remember where the main character Farah is kind of like angry that the love interest Tamlin is not jealous about something, and I was just like, wait, why would he be jealous? And I was like, oh, right, they're supposed to be attracted to each other, but I didn't feel it. I didn't feel it at all. So that's why that one just really doesn't work for me. But for some reason, I really loved the ending of that book. Like I really, really loved the ending. Because of that, I ended up bumping it up 0.5 star to 2.5 stars. A Court of Mist and Fury though, I loved as much this time around as I did the first time around. So one thing I loved about Court of Mist and Fury is the beginning of the book. There are deep emotional issues that the main character has to go through that I feel like a lot of YA books, even though this is not really a YA series, it's more like a new adult series, like kind of shy away from, especially when it comes to fantasy. But I loved that aspect of the series, and I think that the character work and like just the friendship sort of relationships is really, really well done in this series. Then we have A Court of Wings and Ruin. So Court of Wings and Ruin is when I really started to change my opinion about it, because the first time around I really, really loved A Court of Wings and Ruin. This time around I didn't like it as much, and I think part of it is because I knew what was going to happen. I knew who was safe and who was not safe, and A Court of Wings and Ruin is the book that has like the most action in it. So when it came to action, the first time around I really loved it. The second time around though, because I know who lives and who dies, it was just kind of like, well, this is kind of boring. I already know what's gonna happen. You know what I mean? And then there were other aspects of this book that really kind of annoyed me this time around, that I kind of looked over the first time around because I had those awesome action scenes that I wanted to read. This time around, it was more about the politics and things like that, and it's not really in this book. Like when you get to those political like situations, it instead starts to get petty, deal with more like personal romantic feelings rather than the actual political situation of what's happening, and that really, really annoyed me about this book. So I ended up giving this one 3.7 stars this time around rather than the first time around, in which I gave it 4.5 stars. So yeah, I downgraded this rating quite a bit because of that, but I just feel like the action makes this book really good. There are a lot of other aspects of this book that I really didn't enjoy this time around. Overall, I still really enjoy the series, but it's probably not one of my favorites of all time. So next, I want to talk about The Wise Man's Fear by Patrick Rothfuss. This is the second book in the Kingkiller Chronicles, and I reread this at the beginning of the month. This is one that I've been meaning to reread for a while, and I was surprised by how into it I got. And I feel like the same way, just thinking about like some of the vlog entries that I had when I was reading this book, they were so excited and I was really into this book, but thinking back to it, I don't remember why. There was one section that I remember specifically that I really, really loved. It's the section in which there is this tree that has like metal leaves. He has this like whole training that Kvothe has to go through in order to save one of his friends. Part of it that he has to do is to get to the center of this tree while it's like blowing in the wind and everything. So I loved that whole section of this book, and I think that's why I love this book as much as I do, just because that is just like an iconic memory to me whenever I think about this book. But overall, I feel like this one is not as memorable as some of the other ones, which is why I wanted to reread it, because I didn't remember very much about it, even though I remember enjoying it the first time around, and even the second time around, I really, really enjoyed this book. And I'm definitely really excited for the next book in this series to come out, which is The Doors of Stone, which it's been a while since the last book in this series came out, so hopefully it'll come out soon. But yeah, I enjoyed this one and I gave it 4.5 stars. So the next one we're going to talk about is The Inheritance Cycle by Christopher Paolini, which includes Aragon, Eldest, Brissinger, and Inheritance. So this series won my poll for nostalgic rereads for me to read it in December, and I'm happy to say I reread the entire series in the month of December, and I absolutely loved it. I was not expecting to love the series as much as I did, because the first time around I read it in high school, which is almost a decade ago ago now. And I remember like reading the last book in the series and being very disenfranchised with the series. But like when I was rereading it, I was just like, this is YA fantasy at its best. Like everything about the series I absolutely loved. It has fantastic characters, really good world building, a great fast-paced plot that I can't get enough of, and really, really beautiful writing. Like I loved everything about it. The first book in the series, Aragon, I did feel like was a little bit clunky, but overall I did like the story and everything about it. I ended up giving that one 4.5 stars. And then we have Aldous, which was a lot slower than the first book in the series, but it had kind of like that training aspect to it that I really love. And we got some really, really great revelations in Aldous as well, especially a really good plot twist at the end, which I loved. And I ended up giving that one a 4.5 stars as well. The third book in the series is by far my favorite book in the entire series. I feel like that he finally found that balance between the fast-paced plot, but like the smooth transitions and good pacing. I feel like it worked really, really well in that one. And it also got really political, which is what I love about fantasy, is when it gets really political and you get that side of it more and just those details. I loved that aspect of it. And there are also some really, really great revelations in the third book as well, Brissinger. So I ended up giving that one 5 stars. Definitely my favorite in the series. And then we have Inheritance, which the first time around I really didn't enjoy. I understand why I didn't enjoy it the first time around, but I actually really enjoyed it way more this time around. One thing I really loved about Inheritance is we finally get to see like the darker side of the story, and it has some plot lines that I don't remember from the first time around. Like I think I just completely ignored them the first time around because there was other plot lines that I was more interested in, but I really enjoyed like some of the other plot lines. Like Nasawada, for example, is a character that is kind of a side character, but she has point of views as well. And I don't remember her plot line at all the first time around, but her plot line in Inheritance is really good. Like I really, really enjoyed it. That being said, I do understand why I didn't like Inheritance as much the first time around, just because there are revelations the way there are in the first 3 books, but the revelations in Inheritance are a lot easier to guess, so they're not as surprising. But rereading it, I already knew all of this stuff, so I was just in there for the story and along for the ride, basically. So I enjoyed it a lot more this time around, and I ended up giving that one 4.5 stars as well. Like, this is a series that I am so glad I can love again, because it is definitely one that has shaped the type of books that I read, because after the Inheritance cycle, that's when I started to pick up high fantasy books. That's when I first read the Wheel of Time series, which led me to the Mistborn trilogy, and just tons and tons of other fantasy books that are my favorites of all times. So I have a lot to thank this series for, and I'm glad that I can love it as much as I do again. So thank you guys so much for choosing this one as my December reread, because I definitely really enjoyed it. So the next book I want to talk about is Every Morning the Way Home Gets Longer and Longer by Frederick Backman. So this is a really short novella. It's a 1-hour audiobook that I decided to reread. I read it for the first time before I'd read any of Frederick Backman's other works, so I didn't really know what to expect, but I decided to reread it, and it is fantastic. I really, really, really loved it. It's kind of about the relationship between a grandfather and his grandson, while the grandfather is kind of losing his memory, and it is so well detailed and so well written. I love that aspect of it. It is heartbreaking, but at the same time, like, it is such a great read, and I really enjoyed it, and I ended up giving it 5 stars. So the next book I want to talk about is A Crown of Feathers by Nicki Preto. So I reread this in the month of December, and I'm so happy that I reread it, because I read this for the first time this year when it first came out, like back in, I think it was March I read this. March was like the highest reading month productivity-wise that I read it. So even though I read it and I absolutely loved it in March and gave it 5 stars, it kind of got overshadowed by a lot of the other books that I read in March, because I read a lot of really great YA fantasy in March. So I was really happy to finally get to reread of this one, because it's one of those books that I recommend a lot. But even though I remember loving it, I didn't remember the book that well. This book is set in a world where there were phoenix riders in the past, but now phoenixes are very rare, so they don't really have any phoenix riders anymore. And there are 3 points of view. The main point of view is Veronica, who has an older sister, and together they want to become phoenix riders. So at the beginning of the book, they find some phoenix eggs that they're trying to hatch, and they get separated pretty early on for reasons, that is like one of my favorite parts of the book. And Veronica goes off and has to pretend to be a boy to get into this group of Phoenix Riders. I love that aspect of it, but then there are other aspects that I completely forgot about, because there's also Seth, who is a soldier, and Tristan, who's one of the Phoenix Riders of the group that Veronica is trying to join. What makes this book really great is the history and the lore that the author puts into this book, because it has a lot of world building that I had forgotten about the first time around that I absolutely love. And it also has a very, very fun, fast-paced plot also that you would expect from a YA fantasy, and I really, really enjoyed it, and I'm definitely really excited to continue on with the next book in the series, Heart of Flames, which is coming out on February 11th. So the next book I want to talk about is Nevermoor, The Trials of Morrigan Crow by Jessica Townsend. This is the first book in the Nevermoor series. I am currently still reading the second book in the series, Wondersmith. This series is one of my favorite new middle grade series. It's about a character named Morrigan Crow who's supposed to die on her 11th birthday, but instead she's whisked away by Jupiter North to join the Wondrous Society, and it's just set in this fantastical world. It has beautiful, beautiful world building, and it has a very fun, fast-paced, interesting plot that I absolutely love, and gives me all the Harry Potter vibes that I want from a middle grade series. I absolutely love every second of this series, and I ended up giving Nevermoor 5 stars. So the next series I want to talk about is Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. I'm still currently reading this series, but I did finish the first book in the series, The Final Empire. This is one of my favorite series of all time. If you've been on BookTube before, you've probably heard of the series because it's pretty hyped on BookTube now, but this has been one of my favorite series since even before I found BookTube. The series is set in a world in which there was supposed to be a hero that saved the world, but they failed, and now the Lord Brutal is an immortal emperor that is basically oppressing the entire world, and it's a very depressing world because there's ash that's always falling from the sky and mists that come out at night that people are scared of. And then there's our main character, Vin, who is part of a thieving crew and part of like the Ska underground. The Ska are like the really repressed people in this world, and pretty early on she gets picked up by this other group of thieves that kind of changes her worldview, and I love every second of this series. This series is a fantastic series. It has a very fantastic and hard magic system. It's definitely a must read for any fans of high fantasy, and I highly recommend it. I ended up giving The Final Empire 5 stars. And the last book on this list is surprisingly not a fantasy book, and that's Animal Farm by George Orwell. This is probably my favorite classic of all time. It's a really short book, but it's what I would consider almost a perfect book. It has this idea that it wants to portray, and it portrays it perfectly. This book is about these animals that decide to take over their farms from the humans and run it for themselves. It's basically talking about the communist revolution, but the way everything is depicted, it is just such a powerful book despite being so short, and I love every second of it, especially the ending. The ending is so good. I absolutely love it. I also feel like it's very timeless because even though it's talking about the communist revolution, a lot of the ideas and things that it depicts in this book are still very relevant to our society today. Okay, so that is all I have for you guys. Let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books. I would love to discuss it with you guys. I post videos every Sunday, Wednesday, and Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern time, so consider subscribing. I also post bonus videos. If you want to be notified as soon as I upload, you could click the little bell icon. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up to support my channel. All social media links are in the description down below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.